All right. I think we're good. You should see the presentation on there. All right. This is not.
So we got Thursday, universal Thursday.
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. Yeah, so we had a venue conflict, so National Instruments was thanking them for actually getting us to be here so that we can still continue with the meeting. So but we got one more meeting next month, and then we'll be done for the year, and then we'll start up again in January. So thank everybody for coming. Okay, as mentioned, for sponsors, LastCon has helped pay for the food here, and then the venue, National Instruments, has provided that. So thank you, Ben. I'm Tiana Chandler, the chapter leader. Also have up here listed let's just do this. Also have listed up here the other board members, coordinators. And so if you have any questions about the chapter, please contact one of us. The way we're doing it for now, and maybe next year we can figure out a better way to do this. So this is eligible for 1 hour CPE. And if you need to have a certificate, just please go ahead and email me directly and I'll get you a certificate. To show support for OWASP, we have various opportunities, whether you want to volunteer in our leadership with the chapter itself, speaking opportunities like with these types of meetings, or even just helping out with some local events that we may be coordinating. And also if you show up on Amazon, there's the Amazon Smile, and you can choose OWASP, and a portion would be donated to OWASP. With OWASP, there's no requirement for a membership to attend meetings or participate or using the different resources that are provided online. But to, again, it's more of a support is you can have a membership, either individual, corporate, or there's even student memberships available. And our membership coordinator, Griff, they're in the back. If you have any questions about membership, please contact him. We have a Google Groups mailing list. You do not have to have a Google email account to sign up, but this is how we typically try to send out notifications of different events. So I would encourage you to sign up for it. But if you did want to, there's also the OWASP wiki page, awesome.owasp.org, where we can post the different events. There's a weekly study group going on at National Instruments, typically on every Thursday. And currently they're doing the LastCon badge game 2019. It's essentially just planning for what we would be using for LastCon.
We're actually making the game.
They're actually making the game as part of that study group. So, and I'm not sure exactly what the status of it is. I know it's ongoing, but yeah. So if you're interested, there's a Slack channel that you can join that and keeping up with what status is on that. And then LastCon is coming up in a couple months, so it's coming up pretty fast. It's our 10th year anniversary, and I noted here that our 2 keynotes, we're excited to have them. There's also conference tickets. We do have some 10% discount available for, just want to advertise this out here for people that are attending, and it's if you use the discount code OWASP Austin, as shown here, you can get an extra 10% discount off that. The pre-conference training tickets are now available. We've listed those. It's on our website, and hopefully it's noticeable because I just updated it last night, where you go to lastcon.org and then there's tickets, And then there's the conference tickets, the pre-conference tickets, and then there's where you can also sign up for the free OWASP Top 10 training as well. So we have those available, and limited seats on the training, so I would encourage you, and they're very well priced. So I encourage you to go take a look and see if you want to sign up for one. And as far as the conference schedule, we do have all the speakers selected, and we're just trying to organize the schedule. I believe we should be able to have that published later on this week. So be on the lookout for that. Upcoming chapter events, I have a placeholder here for any OWASP Austin training. We've been trying to look and see if there's any way we can do some other training other than LastCon, like earlier in the year. So again, it's more of a stay tuned kind of note. And we do have a sponsor for the next month's Awesome Security Professionals Happy Hour. And I was told by the sponsor that they're going to offer up for a giveaway 2 Apple earbuds, I think is what they're called. So, but you must be present to win one of those. Other upcoming local events, I have them listed here. Most of them are just from the ISSA calendar. I did get an email from Casey. Yeah. So hopefully there's a using atomic red team to detect, defend against attack techniques. That's going to be next month. I may end up trying to post a link to that somewhere to help people be able to see that, but you can also just Google it and find it as well. And this slide here is mostly just to take a pause to see if anybody here has their company that may be having jobs available that they want to announce.
Thank you. My name is Casey. I work for Teachers Retirement System of Texas. We're a $150 billion pension. We're currently looking for a senior level engineer and architect to work with our investment division. If you have any questions, hit me up after. I'll hang around.
Thanks, Casey. And so now I'd like to present Josh Sokol and Alex Polimeni to present today's presentation.
Thank you, guys. Let's see if we can swap this. Almost there. It'll be worth it. Can you check to make sure it's still showing up on there? Looks like it should be. All right, cool. Hi, everybody. I'm Josh. This is Alex. We are here to talk to you today about a standards-based approach to assessing your organization's cybersecurity maturity. If this talk sounds familiar, maybe you attended at B-Sides. We've done a few things since then, so hopefully you learned something new. If not, hopefully you learned something new anyway. Just real quick about us. I'm Josh, again. I run the security team over at a company called National Instruments, right off of Mopac and Duval. I'm the creator and CEO of a company called SimpleRisk, which is free open source risk management software. And I've been involved with the OWASP Foundation for probably damn close to 13 years. Former OWASP board member, former OWASP Austin chapter leader, and whatnot. That's me. Alex, you want to say hi?
Yeah, I think this is working now.
Excuse that.
Okay. So I run the IT compliance function at National Instruments. So basically anything to deal with auditors. I'll skip rid of this. All right, cool. So I'm actually a second-time speaker now, first time at OWASP, and married a crazy cat lady and became a crazy dog family as well. So, 7 animals now. And Josh has a great story about me getting stuck in a cave, and I'll let him go into it if he wants to at some point.
We don't have time for that. It's a great story, though. Over a beer sometime. Yeah, it's a great story. All right. So when we put this talk together, the reason why I decided to do this talk with Alex, he decided to do it with me, is because we kind of represent two different sides of security. On one side, there's the security piece, where we're defining the technical controls for the organization, we're doing enforcement of the organizational controls, and then on his side, the compliance side, we're helping to define the policies, the guidelines, the standards and procedures. He's helping to validate compliance within defined requirements, so things like maybe Sarbanes-Oxley or HIPAA or whatever, GDPR kind of thing. And so it's kind of two different sides of the same coin, but we each have different roles within that coin. So the background here is that Alex and I were asked to assess our organization's cybersecurity maturity. We were asked to create a roadmap for National Instruments going out 3+ years, which is actually a pretty daunting task. We had used Gartner, and Gartner actually has a really great kind of high-level security assessment. But one, it costs money. So if you're not a Gartner customer, that's hard to get. And the advice that ultimately comes from it is like, you need a CISO. And you're like, yeah, I knew that, right? And so the advice is pretty high level. It's not a roadmap. So what is organizational cybersecurity maturity? Basically what we're looking at is how mature our organization is. And so the first piece is how effective the people, the processes, the technology are at mitigating cybersecurity risks, right? So that's probably a lot of your jobs in this room. Your job is to kind of evaluate what's going on and then define what those processes are to mitigate the risk in your environment. If you have an immature control, then management can and should be held accountable for that, right? There's very little confidence regarding their overall cybersecurity risk mitigation plan. So an example of this would be something like an endpoint, but we only have password protection. We don't have any additional controls on there. And then lastly, if you have a mature control, that basically means that management has more confidence for their overall cybersecurity risk program. So if that same endpoint now has full disk encryption, complex password requirements, multi-factor authentication, and so on, your organization has a higher level of confidence in that. So when we look at maturity, we're basically looking at that kind of range, right? We start off with, you have very little, and then maybe you end up with, hey, we have a lot. But the reality is, if we're basing this on like a 1 through 5 scale, most of your stuff's probably going to be something like a 3, right? But it's all about understanding where you are and where you want to get to. So that's really what we're trying to do here. We want to create a roadmap, and we want to start with where we are today. We want to assess our organization and say, this is how our controls fit today. This is how mature we are with these controls. And then the end is where we want to get to. And then everything in between becomes our roadmap. So what we really need to do in order to assess where we are today is we need some sort of a control framework, right? We have to be able to say that we're going to base our organization controls on this control framework, and that embodies what we're looking to assess. And the cool thing about this is your framework is kind of your choice. So if you have a heavy focus on privacy, your framework might be GDPR, right? In our case, our emphasis was around cybersecurity. And so we looked at several different frameworks. We looked at NIST 853, 800-171, the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We looked at ISO. And eventually what we did is we kind of said, well, this NIST thing looks pretty cool, right? If you haven't looked at NIST Cybersecurity Framework, it is a pretty robust framework. It does not include data privacy. There's actually a subsequent framework that NIST has put out specifically around data privacy. But when we looked at CSF, it was free. It was full of kind of best practices. There wasn't anything in there where I looked at it and said, yeah, we don't really need to do that because, you know, we're not that advanced or whatever. Everything in there I could kind of get along with and say, yeah, that makes sense. And then, as I mentioned, it's relatively complete, minus some things like data privacy. So in terms of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, if you're not familiar with it, there's basically 5 functions that they identify. The first one is identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. So if you think about it in terms of like what your organization does to ensure security, those are kind of the bits of it, right? You have to identify the threats in your environment. You have to be able to protect from threats. You have to be able to detect when attackers on your network are exploiting those threats or those vulnerabilities. You you have to be able to respond once you've detected it, and then ultimately you have to be able to recover from it. So when you break it down like that, it actually makes a lot of sense. So the cybersecurity framework then takes each of those different 5 functions and it breaks down further. So each function has several categories, and there's 23 categories in total. So just looking at identify, that first one, it breaks into asset management, business environment, governance, risk assessment, risk management, and then supply chain management. So lots of different facets of identification, and you have controls that are associated with each of those. And so when you start looking at each individual category and then the subcategories, it looks something like this. So there's actually 108 different controls across NIST Cybersecurity Framework. And so this one category right here, which is asset management, or ID.am, identify.asset management, it basically talks about what you have to do to manage assets in your organization. And so each of those subcategories, we basically consider a control. So IDAM1, for example, is physical devices and systems within the organization are inventoried. Right? That makes a lot of sense. We see plenty of other frameworks that talk about inventorying assets. So you look at that. Number 2, software platforms and applications within the organization are inventoried. Again, now we're looking at the software in our organization. So when we started looking at NIST Cybersecurity Framework, it actually made a lot of sense.
So now that we know what we're using, the next step is to understand where we're currently at. So with that in mind, we went through and we established criteria. Sorry about that. We established criteria to determine, based on our environment and our criterion, how we feel we map up against these. So for example, if something was not implemented, it got a 0 score, and we said this just does not exist or it's not applicable. And then as we went up, we were saying a perform process is something that we do ad hoc. It's an informal process. No one really owns it, but people do it. As we go up the hierarchy, managing a process means there's a defined owner. There's some documentation around it. It's a little less ad hoc, but it's still not where you would necessarily want something that's a high-risk area. And then when we've established a process, that means there's robust policies and procedures. It's performed in a standard fashion across various departments or functions within IT. Predictability refers to the ability to audit it, whether it's internal through management or internal audit or external audit. And then optimize means we've automated it or made it to or brought it to a point where we feel that there really isn't much more we can do to improve the control and keep it within a rational cost benefit cost benefit. So when we assess our current maturity, we basically went through each of these subcategories, which in audit terms I would call a control objective. And we said, okay, well, for example, how are we doing with physical asset management? An optimized process might be something that looks like e-discovery of your assets that gets tagged throughout the process. It is replicated to multiple sources that need it for problem management, whatever. And as you go down, that same process, if you say is predictable, maybe it's a manual log of physical servers or something like that you're currently writing in saying, well, we have these disks on this servers or this blade on this server, et cetera. And we went through each of these control objectives or subcategories to really assess where we were at. And it was a gut check. I mean, Josh and I debated on a fair few of these, and it took probably 3 full days of discussion to where we got to a point where we agreed where we were at. And some of that also was going to our boss and saying, okay, this is where we're seeing the disconnect. What do you think? And we also vetted our responses with him, and we fell to a pretty comfortable position. So basically when you're doing this, the best thing I could say is be honest with yourself. Everyone wants to think they're doing everything the best they can. It doesn't do you any good to BS yourself, because if you do that and you're wrong, it only is exposing yourself to more problems later. And then you want to err on the side of caution. If you're talking about, well, is this established? Is this managed? Or if you're struggling between the two, my take is if you're too rosy and you make a mistake and someone has to come in, whether it's OCR for HIPAA or your SOX auditors, whomever we're talking about, if they're looking at what you've graded your controls at, and they say there's no way this is the case, like you have to show me where is your policy on this? Where is the management audit of this control? And you can't prove it, it sets yourself up for a lot more liability and becomes more difficult to negotiate away some of the good faith errors that may have occurred. So you have to consider your environment as a whole. So one area where Josh and I had sticking points, I think, is we have certain areas in infrastructure or apps that do things great. Certain teams that are just very mature, they know what they're up against, and they manage their threats and their risks appropriately. And other teams, they just aren't as focused on that because either they don't have the personnel that have expertise in that, or maybe they don't understand the risk landscape, things like that. This kind of goes back to my previous point about being honest with yourself and knowing, like erring on the side of caution. If the security team does something amazing, let's say with change management, we can't say everyone does it amazing. We have to we have to go with like the real response there. Like as an organization, do we manage these changes appropriately? Are we managing the risk? And then this is where the compliance hat comes in for me. You've got to be prepared to defend your response. And this means either going to your management and saying, well, this is where we're at and this is why we said this. Because when you start talking to a control owner or control objective owner and you say, we're deficient in this area and we need to put on the roadmap to improve to this future state, they're going to push back. And it is a very sensitive subject, and I'm guessing Josh would attest as well. If you don't have the data to back it up and you can't prove your response out, it makes your credibility look not right there, right? Anyways, and then we went and we had to make sure everyone knew that this was going to upper level management, that we weren't going to set ourselves up for lack of buy-in from executive leadership. And I don't remember desired material. Still me? All right, awesome. All right, so basically you need to understand your current risks. You need to understand management's appetite for risk, and you need to understand what it's going to take to get there. You can't just give out blanket statements. So for example, logging always comes up as a high cost, potentially low reward area. That's one thing I've constantly had to battle because for regulatory reasons, logging is imperative, but it isn't necessarily imperative for everyone to maintain it for 7 years, let's say. So the question is, how do we comply with everything that we need to comply with, as well as management expectations for cost management, things like that? So part of that is your risk appetite. So what is management, what is executive leadership willing to take on? And then it's also the overall goal you want to set. Do you want to be NIST compliant or ISO certified, or are you comfortable with being where you feel you're managing the risk because you're a startup company or a lower cap company that's really aggressively fighting to grow? Those are all considerations we had to make. And then be reasonable. I can't tell management to buy $1 million solution for a $10,000 fix, right? Or $10,000 of risk. And this is constantly a discussion we get into regarding a number of subjects, applications to purchase for asset discovery or things of that nature where they're precursors to major initiatives. Now, you have to remember to be reasonable when you're being audited as well. So one issue we've gotten into personally is historically the auditors try to dictate what our response is, and we've been very good. Josh was very good at saying, no, this is what we're doing. We won't go that far. We'll stop here. When I took over compliance, we took it a little bit further in some ways where we had to expand the scope doubly. And by doing so, management fought back a lot, didn't agree with things, and it created kind of audit burnout, compliance burnout, and it affected security as well, correct? So basically we use the same criteria that we used in the current assessment to manage where we wanted to be. Now, what's important to remember here is, for example, Josh and I, when we say this is where we want to be, it's not where we personally feel we need to be. It's engaging with the security leader or our director of information security, risk and compliance, engaging with our VP and other leaders of the organization, not just what we personally gut check. And that calibration was probably the most difficult part of this process, because we had to both justify what our response was and then understand what that meant to the organization as a whole. So we went back to the control objectives. And by control objective, we said, well, we are optimizing this location. Is that where we want to stay? Maybe we'll lower it to auditable. Maybe it's not something we feel is that risky. Or, for example, for IDAM4, we're saying its management really needs to be established because the risk is there where it needs a little bit more structure. Anywhere where there was a gap, we identified improvement that we needed to make, and that was a risk, whether it was overinvestment in a process or underinvestment in a process. So at this point, we now have our current and our future state, and the only way you're really going to get there is by having your comment or be able to explain to the control owner or the process owner why you've indicated those scores, right? So, for example, if I'm saying something needs to be optimized for access management, let's say, it needs to be understood why it needs to be optimized and where we currently are and why it got the score it did. And then you identify the parties appropriate, whether it's the process owner for the service desk or procurement because they're buying the goods, what have you. And now, Josh, for the defining of the risks.
Yay. All right, so as Alex mentioned, where there's a gap, there's a risk. And so basically, as we're looking through this, we want to see what our current capability is, what the desired capability is, and where they match. That's a good thing, right? Because we are basically, our current level of maturity is the same as the desired level of maturity. However, if we look down here, we've identified several different controls where we are not operating at our desired level of maturity. And so everywhere where we see that, there's basically a gap, which means that we have a risk. So let's take one of these as an example. In this case, IDAM5, we said we're a perform process, which just as a reminder, we're saying that individuals are doing it, but it's defined basically as tribal knowledge, right? There's no real documentation around it. If you ask that team how they do it, it's going to be different than how that team says they do it. And what we said is we want to get this to an established process, meaning we have an identified owner, they're held accountable for that, we have formalized policies and procedures, right? So we want to basically bridge the gap between this one and this one. So the risk that we define in this example is that there's no defined processes or ownership for the prioritization of resources based on classification, criticality, and business. So we've identified what that gap is. We've come up with a risk to basically address that gap. And so you can use any sort of GRC, governance, risk, and compliance tool to capture that. In my case, we use SimpleRisk at NI. It's the tool that I wrote. And so we're pretty damn familiar with it, right? So basically how this works is we pop in a subject. The subject is the risk, which I just gave you. And then we go and we populate the other values in there. So we can give it a category, we can define locations. In our case, we're defining a control regulation as NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We can identify the control number. In this case, it's IDAM5, that asset management one. If it affects a specific asset or groups of assets, we can define those. Technologies, teams, owners, Risk source, we give it a likelihood and an impact so that we can kind of define where this risk sits in terms of all the other things. And then we have a risk assessment. So the assessment is just, we currently don't have any defined process or ownership for the prioritization of resources based on classification, criticality, and business. Pretty simple. And then earlier this year, we actually released a version that includes tagging, which is actually hugely powerful because now what you can do is you can tag it different ways and you can pivot when you're looking at the reporting based on those values. So in this case, I tagged it as identify. So I can look and I can see what are all my risks that have to do with identify. And I can tag it as asset management, the IDAM, so we can focus in on that specific thing. Or if we want a specific control, we can just look up that control number that we identified already. So we can use these tags in order to kind of pivot on that. In terms of defining a risk score, we basically assign the risk value based upon a few things. First, the degree of a difference between the current and desired state. If you can imagine, if we're relatively immature and we want to get to a state where we're automating everything, there's probably a big gap there. And so that's a higher level of risk. Also, the potential operational and financial impact given a complete failure of the process. So, you know, as Alex mentioned, he was talking about logging. If our organization is not logging, but there's an expectation that we're supposed to keep 7 years worth of logs, and all of a sudden something happens, right? That's a big deal. So we want to make sure that we identify that. And then lastly, the likelihood of a complete failure of the process. So we want to say, what was the likelihood that we would have needed those logs for 7 years, and all of a sudden they come asking for those logs, and we go, oh, crap, we didn't keep this, right? So that's how we determine the risk score. And as I mentioned, you can pivot based on those tags, which is going to give you different versions of the report to see. But the cool thing is, it's automatically going to calculate that score. So as you go through and you say, this is the likelihood and this is the impact, it's automatically going to say, hey, here's the risk score. And then once you have that risk, once you understand what the risks are in your environment, and don't get me wrong, this process took us, Alex and I sat down for 3 whole days and basically walked through and did this whole process of assessing our current level of maturity, desired state of maturity. It probably took us even another couple days to submit all the risks. Once you do that, your job isn't done. Now you have to plan the mitigations, right? We understand what the risks are in our environment. Now we have to determine what we're going to do about that. So again, the GRC tool, SimpleRisk, gives us the ability to do that. So we set a mitigation date, what our strategy is, are we going to mitigate this, how much effort is involved, and all these different values that we're populating help us to make better decisions, informed decisions about how we're going to handle these risks. So we define our current solution. This is being performed by individuals on an ad hoc basis. We define the requirements. In this case, we need to document this process based on classification of criticality, business, whatnot. And then we can even go and we can map all the controls in our control frameworks. We map in the NIST Cybersecurity Framework into the governance side, and now we can actually take those controls and we can tag them to the risks, which makes it even more powerful because now we can go and we can say, show me a list of all of my NIST Cybersecurity Framework controls, and here's all the risks associated with each of those controls. It's pretty powerful, right? So in terms of our roadmap here.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Real quick, 2 questions. One around getting someone to take ownership. And the second one, getting someone to fund the mitigation action that you recommend. Okay,
so I'm going to repeat for online 2 questions. 1, how do you get somebody to take ownership? And 2, how do you get somebody to fund the ownership? So in terms of taking ownership, this actually ends up being probably the easier thing that we're doing here because we basically identified risks that are associated with different areas of infrastructure, applications, whatever. And so you can kind of look in your organization and be like, okay, well, we're talking about logging. We have a logging team. Those are the guys who are responsible for that. Or we're talking about application architecture. Maybe we should have the architect team kind of take ownership of that. So honestly, identifying owners is just a matter of kind of looking around and saying, all right, well, this is the risk. Who's the person responsible for that, right? But to your point, you need to make sure that you have buy-in in this whole process, because if you don't have buy-in and somebody goes, why are you trying to throw more shit over the fence at us, right? then chances are it's not going to get worked on. So you want to make sure that your leadership team is all bought into this as stakeholders. They understand the process, which gets to your second point. Why would I do this in the first place, right? And the answer is, well, let's take a quick poll. How many of you guys have unlimited people and unlimited money? I don't see any hands, right? And so the reality is none of us have unlimited funds. None of us have unlimited cycles to be able to spend on something, and we have to prioritize that somehow, right? And the way that we prioritize that is the risk management process. We look at what are the biggest risks in our environment based on the likelihood of any event happening and the impact of those events. And now we come up with a risk score, which is how big that thing is versus everything else in our environment. And now we just map them to each other, right? Bigger risk means huge opportunity, right? But if that thing happens, that's pretty painful on our business. And so now when we start talking about what we're going to address, we can start looking at that. What's the highest risk in our environment? There's probably another piece in there, which is what is the level of effort required to mitigate it? But that's, again, a business decision. And so we just have to take a look at those things and go, okay, well, we identified our lack of network access controls as the biggest risk in our environment. It's going to cost us $500,000 to mitigate that thing. Do we want to do it, right? It's at the top of our list. Let's start there and kind of work our way down, which kind of gets to this whole roadmap thing. It's a great segue, yeah.
So,
Hey, question on your report, maybe I missed it, just so small. When you evaluate the risk, do you evaluate if the incident happened, what's the cost to the business? Not to prepare, but if, you got ransomware, what's the impact to the business? Is that somewhere on the chart?
Yeah, so there's two components that go into that calculation. One is likelihood and one is impact. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can do risk assessment. There's classic, which is your likelihood and impact. There's dread. There's OWASP, has its own risk rating methodology, whatever. But ultimately, what you're trying to get to is, how do I stack one risk against another risk, right? And it's all based on some form of likelihood and impact. What is the likelihood of this thing happening? Because if it's highly unlikely that this thing is ever going to happen, then that should drag our risk score way down. And then the impact, what is the impact to the business, as you said, if this thing happens, right? And that might be a dollar value loss, it might be a number of systems, it might be data, but you're left, there's a bit of subjectiveness in there, which is understanding like, hey, how does this impact not just me, but how does this impact the organization as a whole, right?
Like if I have a website that sells shoes, someone knocks my website down and I'm down for 4 days.
Yeah.
That's a loss.
Yeah, and if you have a website that sells shoes, given your example, right, and you're down for 4 days, it's not the 4 days down, right? It's what is the loss of being down for 4 days? I mean, if your website does, $1 a day in shoes, you're like, well, that's $4, right? So your impact is going to be way down here. If it does, $1 million a day, right? That's $4 million of revenue loss. And now you're going, okay, well, maybe I should spend some money in order to mitigate that risk.
so just to kind of go off of Josh a little bit on this one, if you can tie your risks to business objectives, business goals, that speaks. So if you're going to tell your VP that, hey, if this goes down 4 days, you're going to incur this cost to the business, and oh yeah, our sales are going to drop 5% for the quarter, whatever, it speaks volumes. And we talk, the first question about identifying an owner, I just want to touch on that quickly. One of the easiest ways I found to do it is say, well, if you don't own this, are you going to be comfortable with me making the decision on this? So if you're going to have to personally take ownership of it as a security professional, that kind of gives you some say into how they're going to have to enact some of those changes, correct? So one thing I have done is said, okay, well, if you don't own this, I'm going to make the decision, and if I make the decision, you're still going to have to do the work. So it's kind of a little bit manipulative, but the intent is to show that they really do care about it, and it's not just something that's imaginary, right? Yeah, that's the biggest thing I wanted to say about it.
And that's the auditor speaking. The security guy in me says that your job is to assess risk and to make sure that the business understands the risk. And if they're not willing to be the ones who actually sign off on the risk, you got bigger organizational issues, right? You need to make sure that your leadership team understands this is a process. The security guys are here to help me navigate the process. And if you don't do your job in terms of assessing and conveying risk, that's on you. If they don't do their jobs in terms of owning the risk and mitigating the risk, that's on them. A lot of times we feel like the weight of the world is on our shoulders as security people, and this is the way we break that cycle, is by using risk management, which is a great segue into this, which is how do we do this, right? How do we prioritize what we're going to work on? And the first thing is burning fires, right? There are going to be things in your organization that are just flat out high priority. Predominantly risks that were scored high by impact and high likelihood. So these are the things that are bubbling to the top. And these are things that could cause serious interruption or financial loss to the company, right? So in SimpleRisk, we have something called the high risk report. And this is literally just a report of here's all the high risk in your environment. So this is a good place to start in terms of identifying what those burning fires are, right? Because these are, in this case, we have half a dozen, 10 risks here. Those are things that we should probably work on, right? Again, pending how much level of effort is involved with those. The second one is quick wins. This is the low-hanging fruit, right? Things that you can accomplish without much assistance from other teams, the little financial personnel investment, that kind of things. And the way that we do this is if when you're planning a mitigation, you say this is the level of effort, we give you something called the risk advice report. And when I say SimpleRisk free, open source, you don't have to pay for this, right? So this report says, here's your top 10 risks based on what the lowest level of effort is and the highest risk. So if I start here, this is telling me this is a trivial risk, and this is a 3.6 on the risk score, which isn't our 10, right? It's not the thing that's going to be, getting rid of the most risk in our environment, but this is best bang for our buck, right? We can spend very little effort and reduce that overall risk score by tackling these things. The third item here is long-term work, and this is thematic issues, right? So an example is we don't have any documentation, right? We don't have a wiki, we don't have anything like that. And so a lot of times these are situations where you might want to consider a policy revamp project. You may want to consider taking on some form of project in order to say, hey, we know that we have a systematic issue here, something that is pervasive across our business. And so we want to tackle multiple different risks together as part of a single project. And so we have the ability to basically create projects in order to group things together. Lastly, we have management goals and objectives. And this gets to what Alex was saying earlier. Does your company have ongoing goals or initiatives that our projects can support? So a couple examples here. If your company is trying to reduce office space, WeWork is a big thing these days, then maybe we can prioritize a remote access policy. Maybe that's the quick win, which directly supports the initiatives that our leadership has put forward, right? Because they've said, we want to move to these WeWork offices. Let's create a policy to support that. That helps reduce the risk. It supports the management goals and objectives, check. Or if our company is trying to make a push towards automation, DevOps, CI/CD, all that fun stuff, cloud. How many more buzzwords can I fit into here? If your company is trying to make a push towards something like that, maybe we want to provide guidance regarding the processes needed. Maybe we need optimized controls because optimize indicates automation, right? It'll help them build out their pipeline while simultaneously accomplishing our security and compliance goals. That makes sense? All right, in terms of ownership, management owns the control environment and any necessary remediation. They're responsible for defining the course of action and directing any projects. And this kind of gets to what Vern was saying, management needs to be bought in on this. They have to say, yes, the issues that are identified, we will address them. That says nothing about the time, the investment, anything like that, but they are defined as the owners of the controls. Management consults with security and compliance. Compliance and security in our organization are considered centers of excellence. We provide the valuable consultative services, but we don't necessarily implement the changes. And in a lot of cases, we don't engineer them either, right? We have specialists in the different areas that focus on that. Now, that doesn't mean we're not providing guidance, right? We are going to provide guidance based on things like security policies, requirements, things like that. And then lastly, security and compliance. The job is to validate management has effectively mitigated the identified risks and making sure that we're communicating to IT leadership or to organizational leadership, this is what has been done. So overall, we're going to look at this whole process and we're going to know management owns the controls. They're going to consult with security and compliance in terms of understanding what needs to be done. And then we're going to make sure that we've communicated the fact that, yes, we have mitigated risk in our environment. So, conclusions.
Thank you, sir. So, this can be used for any environment. It doesn't have to be something for NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It doesn't need to be something for an engineering company. This literally can be done by any company, by security professionals, and not even by security professionals. This really is an audit methodology when you break it down. This is the basics of how an auditor comes in and looks at your information and your processes. And because you're doing kind of what the auditor does in a lot of this, it also helps you prepare for the audit. We leverage NIST CSF because it gave us the best bang for our buck for our program. We are doing some mapping to ISO. We are doing some mapping to other requirements, but by and large, we like NIST CSF. We're running forward with that because it gives us a more direct standardization. You need to know where you are and where you're going to be, because without that, you can't effectively roadmap and you can't communicate to management what the risks are to the environment. And then risk management needs to be implemented in your organization. It needs to run effectively, because that is the backbone of anything you do as a security professional or as a compliance professional or anyone that provides that value to the organization where you're helping improve processes based on maturity. And with that, we use SimpleRisk. It's a great solution for what we are using, or for what our needs were. And it's free open source. So with that.
You want me to say thank you?
Yeah.
Thank you. Questions? Questions? Yeah, Karen.
Thank you, Josh. And it's that's very interesting. I have a question. When your first step is to assess where you are, it's a good choice to select that part. It's fine. When you assess, both of you mentioned you spend like 3 days, whole days to do that. Did you do that just by yourself, or 1, 2 of you, or you actually talk about? I know NI is a large company, right? And you have different divisions. Do you, I mean, look, what's the right word? Ask all the different divisions, different departments to do their part. So you give them a questionnaire or something. How did you actually?
All right. So first off, Karen has validated our choice of NIST Cybersecurity Framework. Thank you, Karen. Secondly, what she's asking is, she says, hey, I know National Instruments is a really big company. Did you guys do this in a silo, or did you work with other groups, right? And the reality is it was kind of somewhere in between. So we're looking at this in terms of the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. We're looking at our IT controls, our IT environment. And so from that perspective, there's somewhat of a silo. We didn't look at our R&D organization or HR or manufacturing, right? That said, IT is really the one responsible for a lot of those controls for the entire enterprise. So even that silo extends to the other organizations. Within our group, for most of the assessment pieces, what Alex and I did is we bounced off of each other. We said, hey, you know, for this particular control, what do you think the desired or the current maturity state is? And he'd be like, well, I think we're not doing anything, so it's a 0. And I'd be like, well, people do this kind of ad hoc, whatever. And I'd cite a few examples. And he'd be like, but in this situation, no, right? I'd be like, well, yeah, but that doesn't really represent the majority. And this is kind of what Alex talked about earlier. There's this kind of middle ground where bouncing off the two of us, we're able to kind of say, well, our consensus is this. And believe me, Alex and I can fight about this stuff. Most of the time is over coffee or beer, so we're good. But ultimately we came to a conclusion between the two of us, but we didn't stop there. So we wrote down notes as to why we came to that conclusion, both in terms of the desired state as well as the current state. And then we took that to our boss and we said, hey, let's go through all of these. And that was a day process in and of itself. And we said, all right, let's start with the first one, work our way down. Here's where we think our current state is. Here's where our desired state is. And you go, okay, well, did you think about this? And we go, I didn't consider that. And so it really is kind of, you have to be willing to compromise. You have to be willing to kind of change your mind. And there were several times where Alex changed his mind based on what I said. I changed my mind based on what he said. But to get to your point, you can't really do this in a silo. You have to be either fully understanding of your organization, right, and have all the answers, or in cases, there were several situations where like, man, I don't know the answer to that one. Let's go talk to so-and-so and figure it out. And so I don't think that you can do it in a silo, but doing all of it outside that silo is going to take a very long time. So there's kind of there's a healthy middle ground, right? Yeah, we did okay.
So we were pretty efficient in this, but reasonably speaking, Josh has been at NI for over 10 years. I've been at NI for just about 3 now. So we have a pretty good understanding of our environment, and I think it depends on the maturity of the people within your function as well, right? So if you mainly run with younger security professionals that may not have the exposure to your business environment or your industry, that may influence who you need in the discussion. But Josh and I are both senior professionals. We're very knowledgeable about the areas we're in, so we're able to make those calls a little easier. So you really need to understand where you are as an organization, both broadly as NI or IBM or whoever you are, and as your security function. Can you make these judgment calls based on your understanding of the environment?
Thank you.
So where's the magic that kept that from turning into herding cats? Because you distributed ownership of the risk to a large group of people, or different areas, and then you required them to actually perform litigation. What made that a priority for them, and how did you convince them?
All right, so the question was, how do we stop this from turning into herding cats? Because we've got a bunch of other people responsible for doing stuff, and then here we are trying to facilitate it, right? And the reality is risk management is herding cats. There's really no getting away from it. The process of risk management is designed to drive visibility and accountability up the chain of management. And the way you kind of get away from the herding cats mentality is to make sure that everybody understands their role in the process. So when I first started out, I had a presentation that I took to every single team in IT, and I said, all right, for the individual contributors, your role in the risk management process is to help to identify risks. And so, I was talking with somebody, I won't name him, but he basically said, Josh, I feel like I'm at the doctor with my pants around my ankles. I'm giving you all the dirty details of our environment. I said, look, the reality of the situation is these risks exist whether you want to tell them to me or not. And if this thing happens and you didn't tell it to me, it's on you, right? That is your fault. If you tell me these things, then my guarantee to you is, 1, I will capture that. And 2, I will drive visibility and accountability up the chain of management. I will make sure that managers see that risk and that our VP or whoever, based on the risk level, is aware of the risk and signs off on it, right? And that's my promise to him. And I think that mentality is really what drives that, right? If your people understand that this is about how do I make somebody else make the decision because I'm not empowered to? And the reality is, if you're an IC, you don't have budget, purse strings, like you can't control the budget, you don't decide who's going to work on what. And so for things like that, it's in their best interest to give you those. From the management level, you basically say, hey, look, these risks exist today. You guys have to understand that our environment is full of landmines, that if these things happen, we're in trouble. So what I can do for you is I can drive the visibility. I can make sure that you have insight into all of these things, and all you have to do is make a decision. And that decision could be, let's fix it. The decision could be, let's buy some insurance in case that thing happens. The decision could be, let's just not do anything about it, right? But the fact is today, without the risk management process, they can't even make that decision. They aren't informed about the things in their environment. But if I give them the risks that are there, if I show them what these things are, then they at least have the ability to do that. And so I think the empowerment, the how do we move away from herding cats, is really in everybody understanding what role they play in this process and seeing the value of that. That makes sense? Cool. Somebody actually.
The one other thing you can try to do is, if you have a PMO function, try to get those projects, and this is going to be the higher risk things, the higher level of effort things, but get them baked into team goals for whoever is the owner. Get them baked into the actual project roadmap from a strategic level, not just one-offing a team lead and saying, hey, this server is not configured or hardened appropriately. You need to fix the configuration settings for it, right? It really comes down to, if you can bundle up enough stuff and make it into a project for them, it helps, because then they have a deliverable. They have something they can be measured against. People do what they're measured against, ultimately.
Yeah.
Two-part question. First part, is there a scoring rubric that comes with this?
Is there a scoring
Rubric, like some way to score your efficiencies?
No, so the NIST Cybersecurity Framework is literally just a set of controls, and we kind of showed like the categories and subcategories earlier. I think the goal from NIST is for you to basically like check yes or no, right? Do we do this or do we not? And that's really the basis of this presentation, is that it doesn't have to be check yes or no. It really should be about level of maturity, because like the very first thing we looked at, do you control what assets are on your network, right? Do you have an asset inventory? Well, there's lots of different levels of asset inventory, right? It's, does everybody enter, what things they bought into a spreadsheet, right? That's a pretty crappy process, but who knows? Do we have that documented? Is there a team that's responsible for asset management? Do we have a system that goes out and scans our entire environment and adds new assets, right? So it's not really a yes or no, it's what level are we at? And that's really why we took this process and drove it further, is because we wanted to be able to say, this is our level of maturity, right? Not yes or no, but we're a 2. And then we want to get to a 4, and how do we bridge that gap? And this also makes for some really nice reports. I probably should have put them in here, but you can do some really cool like spider charts with this, where you say like, hey, in the identify section, here's where we score, right? And then you don't really have like an industry average to benchmark it against, but you can at least say, here's where we are and here's where we want to get to, right? Now there's a nice visualization. You can do the same thing at the higher level and show, each of the identify, detect, whatever, and then show where you want to get to there. So when it comes to road mapping this, and this was the whole point for us, they said, we want to understand what your roadmap looks like. You go, boom, here's our roadmap. This is our current maturity state. This is our desired maturity state. Here's the highest level risk. Here's the investments that we need to make in order to drive to that new roadmap.
The second part of the question is, did you guys investigate BSIM before you standardize on this?
Yeah, so BSIM, I have a little bit of experience with it. I've got much more experience with the OWASP version, which is OpenSAM. I would kind of file that along the same lines as like the Gartner thing, where it's good in terms of kind of high level guidance, but it's not a roadmap. It doesn't say, here's where you are, here's where you want to get to, and here's how you here's how you drive that path, right? And so nothing against BSIM, it's a great framework for kind of assessing overall maturity, but it didn't get me to where I want to be. Plus it costs money. So that's another fun thing, yeah.
With your
I
software,
picked you. Yes, okay.
with your software package, I haven't gone to get out and looked at it. You encourage people to kind of give their scores so that over time that people can kind of measure, not who, what company, but where the world is.
So the question was with SimpleRisk, do we take information and use that for like baselines and things like that? No. So the SimpleRisk tool, it communicates a little bit of information back, like how many users you have and how many risks, but it doesn't say like, here's the specific risk that this organization has. I don't want that information. That's a liability on me. You could use some of that information for like benchmarking and stuff, but I think the reality is we're in an industry where sharing that stuff is kind of frowned upon, and especially if that were done without your knowledge. So we've kind of shied away from that.
Yeah, that's always disappointing. It's like everyone wants to keep it secret. It's like,
Yeah.
you know, where is the industry now? I mean, we all have issues.
There are definitely
To kind of look at every business is different. It's like, you know.
there are definitely organizations that you can go to where you can get that kind of shared knowledge approach. I think they're called like the CISSP or something like that. Like there are organizations based on your industry that you can go to, and it's kind of the shared data mentality. Yeah.
Okay.
Other questions, Vern?
Yeah, they're implementing a maturity model, if you will, for government contractors.
Mhm.
And so it's kind of taking the 800, 171 and then, you know, staging levels of compliance, if you will. And so that's going to be a grading program that they're putting in place concerning contracts.
Yeah.
Award contracts.
Yeah, so Vern's comment is basically there's NIST 171, which is the government's kind of standard around awarding contracts, and there's some sort of maturity modeling that they're doing around that. So we've looked at the NIST 171 as a supplier to government organizations at NI. It's a great framework. It's not all that different from the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It's just a different lens. So 800-171 is really all about for the government and any contractors and subcontractors, it's a set of requirements for you to do business with the government. And so if you can imagine like Lockheed Martin, which makes planes for the government, they have subcontractors who help with the chips and the missiles and the whatevers. All that line needs to be protected. And so 800-171 is how you build security into the supply chain risk management.
Yeah, one other question. How about monitoring progress towards completion or, continuous monitoring to make sure that people haven't slacked off?
Yeah.
What they were supposed to do.
Yeah, so in the SimpleRisk system, you can basically set mitigation dates. So you can say, hey, I expect this to be done by this date. And then there are ways to basically track that and say, hey, I want to get an email when this date has passed, or I want to get an email 2 weeks before that deadline or whatever. So there's ways to kind of drive those workflows into your organization. It's just a matter of how far you want to take it.
So also going off the monitoring continuous improvement thought, this isn't a point in time activity. This should be a recurring activity. So from a compliance or from a just continuous improvement perspective in general, one of the big things is making sure this type of risk assessment is recurring to me annually, or when you have major changes to your environment. Now, how you define a major change to your environment is really up to you and your company. But what that means to me is introduction of a major tool in our security pipeline, or introducing a major change platform, something like that, right? Something that will change the way IT does business, or materially affects the risk decisions we've made up to that point. With that in mind, yes, there's the point in time remediations that we've identified, but management's appetite may also change, and we need to reevaluate that as well. So it talks about our current state and reviewing our current state, but also, do we really care if we're still optimized? Can we downgrade this? Do we need to upgrade something from audited to optimized based on company objectives, things of that nature?
Anybody else? Cool. Oh, yes.
I was just gonna say, to amplify your point, we're gonna get into a period where IT is going to be the reason the company can stay alive. And like you're burning fire or whatever, by having shown that you're going through that, and you're good in a position, those objectives will have IT objectives, like moving to a fully cloud environment, not having any internal. I know maybe you've already not there, but it's going to be much more dependent. So the company, the business itself has got to get rid of these.
Yeah, that's a good point. So IT is kind of in bed with the business, right? And everything that we're doing, whether it be this push for the cloud, the push for automation, whatever, we're IT is kind of helping the business along this path. And so all these risks, they end up being business risks, right? It's things that you need to make sure are understood kind of at all levels of the organization. Absolutely. Cool, guys. Thank you so much for your time. We can give you the slides.
Did you want your water, Josh? We toss it?
That's not my water.
Oh, I got it for you.
Oh, thanks.
I've never heard his name.